We have Andre Knappe. He is German, but he is also part of the NATO. He looks at the air defense part of NATO, and we have him for a conversation. So, Andre, on NATO, people who are not part of the NATO alliance look at NATO with a bit of skepticism as a body which has more than 24 members, supposedly the most powerful military alliance in the world. And yet, when it comes to decision making, it seems that it's very messy, the decision making, and NATO is not able to take decisions quickly or fast enough to meet some of the more emerging challenges of the world. What is your take on how the alliance is functioning?
Yeah, thank you. I cannot agree with that. So I would say, what is NATO? NATO are 29 nations. And 29 nations, when they find a decision, it's so powerful that alliance power, when 29 nations agree on something to do, and they do a lot. So from the air perspective, what we do is the NATO air policing, what we do is NATO ballistic missile defense, and this is agreed by 29 nations. And we do it together, and this is a strong alliance, and that's the power of the alliance.
But, for example, again, I would imagine that the security priorities of, countries north of, in Northern Europe or Eastern Europe would be very different from the security challenges and priorities of countries on the south. For example, during a trip to the NATO headquarters a couple of years back, Russia seemed to be looming very large, in the NATO calculations. But when we would talk to them about the challenges of terrorism coming from the south into countries like France and others, it wasn't seen as such a big deal. So clearly, is there a problem in terms of deciding the priorities which the alliance has to undertake, or is that not such a big deal anymore?
So let me compare this, what we do here during the Raisina Dialogue. So what we do is here, and it's the same in NATO, we have a 360-degree approach. So we recognize that the threats, it's not only one threat, there are a lot of threats, and the threats are 360-degree around NATO territory. And I think it's the same what we do here during the dialogue. So, and this is the most important thing on that, to understand there are different perceptions, and it's all about perception. And this is what is fantastic here on that dialogue, to get the possibility to discuss with people from over 86 nations here, different perceptions, different point of views on topics. What for the one is value is for the other one maybe a threat. And that is very important to understand. And I think especially for the young leaders here, it will be very, very interesting for them and important for them to understand that there are so many different perceptions. So I see it from that point of view, the rules, the laws, the mechanism we use to explain what's going on the world, we used yesterday, they are not anymore valid nowadays. And it will be very, very important to understand different perceptions. And I compare with, you need some antennas on your head to understand how people look on something like that. And it's the same with threats.
But, so the point which I'm trying to make is that I can understand that there would be differing perceptions. For example, Germany or Poland, would certainly have a greater threat perception of Russia compared to maybe some other countries of Europe or part of the NATO alliance. But because, Raisina is a dialogue, but NATO is an alliance, so surely the dynamics within NATO on what challenges to prioritize, what threats to address, is there some kind of a tussle which happens all the time, or is it something which is quite seamlessly decided?
So what you touch with that question is, that's a kind of, I call it a dilemma. So, and this is also when you see how broad the dialogue from the topics is. And it's the same with threats. It's so broad, it's so wide, it's so many, and it's different to find priorities in that. And if you decide for a priority, maybe it is not anymore valid in 1 year, in 2 years, in 3 years. So I think the world is too complex. The world is moving too fast, too quick to make really good priorities. So that means at least you have to get prepared. And this is what we mean with the 360-degree approach. You can't prioritize on one. You need this 360-degree approach.
To come back to something like terrorism, because while some NATO countries were involved in offensive operations in Syria, while the IS was present out there, most other NATO countries were not, NATO as an alliance was not participating in, the aerial attacks, for example, on IS targets. But NATO as an alliance has been present in Afghanistan. Somehow NATO hasn't been able to really achieve much as far as Afghanistan is concerned. But when individual NATO countries undertook offensive operations in Iraq, they certainly had a lot more to show for it. How does this dichotomy work? Was the failure or the relative failure in Afghanistan part of the problem of how decision making in NATO is made? While when individual countries are acting, for example, in Syria, there is a lot more room for maneuver, a lot more independence of action, and they're not hopped in by the NATO procedures. Would that be a fair assessment to make?
I think Karzai today, former president of Afghanistan, we had here during one of the panels, he touched something that is very important to understand Afghanistan and the situation in Afghanistan. If you look on that, and your question was now covering it more from a Western perspective, you have to see it from the Afghanistan perspective. And I think Mr. Karzai covered that very good today during his speech. You have to see it from the Afghan perspective. And Afghanistan needs time. And when you look on military solutions for Afghanistan, you have to understand, I think military is a tool. And we are part in a toolbox, but there are a lot of other tools which has to be in place for that. So if you compare it with a toolbox and military, what is military? Military is a hammer in the toolbox. And if you use that hammer, what can you do with that? You can put in a nail in the wall, but then you need to think about what kind of picture do you want to bring on the wall.
Fair point. Right. But as far as Afghanistan is concerned, the NATO is still committed in Afghanistan. The Americans have pumped in more troops. Clearly, the way the security situation has developed in Afghanistan, things seems to be going a little out of control. What is the chance of the NATO, number one, getting a little more committed in terms of putting in resources in Afghanistan? That's point number one. And point number two is NATO countries, in a sense, there is also an overlapping between EU and the rest of the West. Is the NATO or the NATO countries or the NATO as an alliance going to be on the same page as President Trump as far as the new Afghan policy is concerned? Or is there likely to be some differences out there?
So my personal view on that is we do one mistake. And the mistake is, and the question is perfect for that, to understand the mistake. We measure military success with troops numbers.
Right.
And from my point of view, that is the wrong measure instrument to have a look on the success of a mission. And Afghanistan and the mission in Afghanistan, it's so complex, and it's not only about military. It's a comprehensive approach in Afghanistan. And it's a comprehensive approach, which means military, civilian instrumentarian has to be in place, police, society has to be developed and all that.
Fair point.
And as I said before, it needs time. Afghanistan needs time.
What about Russia? Is Russia still becoming this big threat, which was the origin of NATO really? Or have things started cooling down as far as the NATO-Russia relations are concerned? Because there was a lot of, discomfort in Russia over this whole business of the NATO expansion, but that seems to have stopped for now. But is the tension still at a high, or have things started cooling down somewhat?
I think that question you have to see from different perspectives. Also, it's not only about military, and it's not only about NATO. And when we talk about, and I think there's also one mistake we make. So we say NATO and we say Russia, while Russia is one nation, and NATO are 29 nations.
Yes.
With different opinions, with different relations to Russia. I would not mix an international institution, with a country.
Right, that's a fair point. Thanks a lot, Andre.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you so much.
You're welcome.